Okay, so this session is on active learning, and the focus is primarily on active learning in a face-to-face environment, although there are online analogs for many of these things. There are synchronous online analogs for many of these things, not so many with asynchronous online, but we did a workshop on that recently. I think back in January. So what is active learning? Well, it's not passive learning, and passive learning is what you would see if you walk by probably 95% of the classrooms at any given time on campus, where students are sitting there, not always quietly, but in any case, they're sitting there listening to an instructor lecture, which, if you walk through the hallways, you see a lot of that, and much of it really doesn't look that much different than it would have a century ago, other than the fact that now we have whiteboards rather than blackboards in a lot of classrooms. One second. Okay. Sorry, Amy, I muted you. Okay. Active learning is when the students are actively engaged with course materials. And we're just going to talk about a few ways in which we can do that. There's a wide range of active learning activities. Some only are a few minutes. For those of you who participated in the first small teaching reading group, that whole book focuses on active learning activities that can be done in generally 5 to 10 minutes in a class without changing anything else in your class. So you can do some really short, brief active learning activities, or you could completely devote a class session or a series of class sessions to one or more active learning activities. And we'll talk about some of the variety of those as we go through. So you can start small and then ramp up to more. And let's talk about some general reasons why you might use it. The main thing is that in general, there's a tremendous amount of research that suggests that when students engage in active learning, they end up with deep learning, which is a somewhat loosely defined term, but it's a phrase that Ken Bain and a few others have been using for years, so I'm using it here. Basically, what it means in practice is that people have improved long-term recall, that the things they've learned, they remember for a longer period of time. And especially if we're teaching introductory courses, we'd really like them to remember those things for the courses that build on those, because I know when I teach an upper level class, it's really frustrating to see how little many students remember from what they had in earlier courses. And, we have to build that in, obviously, or provide support for students. But the more we can encourage students to learn, especially in our early courses, the better off they'll be later on. So that long-term recall is really kind of helpful. And if we want students to leave here with some skills, it would be nice if they remembered some of those things they've learned, beyond the current semester, beyond that final exam. The other thing is that with active learning, students have improved transferability, which means they can take the concepts they've learned and apply them more effectively in other situations than if they've been engaged in more passive learning. So basically, it provides more critical thinking. It means that students are learning things that they can apply in a wide variety of circumstances. And that's kind of useful too. Another thing is that in dozens and dozens of studies, that active learning has been demonstrated to reduce equity gaps. We know that first-gen students end up with poorer academic outcomes. We know that Pell-eligible students in general from schools that are poorly resourced and from low-income households end up doing significantly less well in terms of their grades, in terms of persistence. And we know that students from historically minoritized groups tend to do less well. Although I should note that when you control for poverty status and when you control for first-gen status, most of the racial differences disappear anyway. So it's the poverty and the resources that students have had in the past that seem to be the primary cause of these equity gaps. But the use of active learning benefits all students, but it disproportionately benefits students who in general tend to perform less well. And another factor is that it improves metacognition, because in a typical lecture type class, students have 3 or 4 high stakes assessments. And basically, by the time they learn how well they've learned on materials, if there's only 3 or 4 exams or papers or something similar, and they haven't had much of a chance to practice and so forth, it's often too late for them to recover. And it's often too late for them to develop a better understanding of what they learn. Active learning, because students are actively engaged in learning and they're getting feedback throughout the process in some form, makes it easier for students to understand what they know and what they don't know, which is really important if you want students to develop into lifelong learners. Active learning techniques, I should know, and I think I mentioned this later, that often though, in practice, students resist active learning techniques for this very reason, because it's really easy to sit in a lecture and listen to everything and it seems to make sense. And students only generally have problems when they work on problem sets for an exam, and they'll often blame the instructor for that, rather than not recognizing it. Maybe they didn't learn things as well as they thought. With active learning techniques, because they're actively engaging with the content throughout the course, they're testing their understanding, they're using it, they're trying to create new learning objects or trying to make sense of things. They often get feedback that says, well, you haven't quite mastered this yet, which is not as pleasant. In general, there have been many, many studies that find that students prefer lecture to active learning. However, all those studies also show that students who have worked with active learning end up learning more and are more successful. It just doesn't feel that way because students' learning gaps become exposed earlier, which doesn't feel as good. It's one thing to, be upset one day when you get a really bad test. It's another to see for a while that you really don't understand many things that you thought you understood as you move through the course. But that improved metacognition is a really useful skill. And also students with improved metacognition are more efficient and more effective learners, which again leads to additional learning. There have been some structural equation models recently that have been studied that find that the improved metacognition directly increases learning in response to the direct effect of the active learning techniques. So some basic techniques. If you're primarily using lecture, I just put together a few active learning techniques, and then there's a whole set of resources that I'll share, which I only started putting together earlier today. I'm running a little behind, I'm sorry. Think, Pair, Share is one of the most common one. Everyone's familiar with Think, Pair, Share? Yeah. Pretty much, okay. Polling is another technique. There was workshops on that, but with both activities, you're getting students to engage with the material, process it, think about it, and apply it, and share back to the group in some way, so that they're getting some feedback on their understanding of material. Another activity, which is less commonly used, it goes by a number of names. One of the most popular is a memory dump. And that is, if you have a lecture class, you just pause periodically and you ask students to write down their summary of what they recall from what they've just heard. And then you compare that, they compare that, again, partly a think, pair, share, but at least the think and pairing part, where they'll compare that with the notes that someone else had about what happened around them. And by doing that, they're filling in each other's gaps. So if students missed a concept or misunderstood it, they get to share, they get to solidify their understanding through that interaction with their peers. And you could poll them on that if you'd like, or you could ask them to summarize what the major points in that argument was, or what the major points that was just addressed. And you can do that with lots of things, but basically it's a form of retrieval practice. And retrieval practice is one of those things that in every study that's been done for at least about 1.25 centuries have been found to be one of the most important predictors of learning. The more you practice retrieving information, the more you remember it and the longer you remember it. And memory dump is a useful activity. Collaborative note-taking is similar in some ways, where students might take notes in the Google Doc that's shared with other students, so they can, they don't have to do all the note-taking, but they can see what other people are adding to those notes and so forth. Or they could do it separately and then share their notes and consolidate them into a more complete set of notes if you're doing lectures. So these are techniques that can add some active learning components to a lecture. And one thing, I've mentioned this in past workshops, and I think most of you have heard the argument, but when you do polling, if there are correct answers to it, a really common practice is to poll students once, look at the results yourself and see how they did on it. If 95% of the students understand the concept and got it correct, you can just move on with a very brief explanation of it. If you find that 10% of your students were able to answer a question correctly, then you may want to backtrack and spend more class time building on that material. So it gives you some feedback on what students are learning, as well as giving students feedback on what they understand. But if you have somewhere 50% or so of the class of the students, maybe 50 to 80% getting it correct, or even 40 to 80% getting it correct, then what you can do is you can ask students to discuss it with someone else and then vote again after they've had that chance to collaborate and to argue about it. And what I'll generally do, I do this a lot in my large class, and actually in many of my small classes, I'll then ask students to find someone who had it near them who had a different response, and try to convince them that their response is better, and to listen to the other person's argument, and then to vote again. And that's a technique that was developed by Eric Mazur, and it's been shown to be extremely effective in increasing learning and knowledge retention. And students always do better after they've had that chance to collaborate on it. Another approach which has been really popular, which has been growing in popularity for the last 15 years or so, is a flipped classroom. And that became even more popular since the pandemic. And the basic goal is you take much of what normally in a traditional class took place in the classroom, and the stuff that normally took place out of the classroom, and you reverse it. So instead of having students do most of their basic concept learning by listening to lectures, they do that outside of class. And then the in-class time is spent on that type of work on problem sets, applications, and other things that typically had been done as homework assignments or out of class assignments. And the advantage of that approach, of a flipped classroom approach, is that the lecturers often focus on the basic concepts, the lower levels in Bloom's taxonomy of understanding and recall and so forth. And those are things that are relatively easy for students to pick up with effort. But then students face the harder parts essentially on their own when they were working on homework assignments or when they were on an exam. And so with a flipped classroom, they do the basic learning of basic concepts outside of class, and then they focus on applications and higher levels of Bloom taxonomy in work within the classroom, often in small groups where the instructor can support them. And in order for this to work, though, we have to ensure that students do come prepared for class. And one way of doing that is doing some pre-class quizzing. It could be a video that one of the things I use in my intro classes is a series of short videos that cover some of the basic, that would have been the material that would be in a lecture, but broken up into 5 to 12 minute short video lectures with questions embedded throughout those, where they're responsible to do those before they arrive in class. And that, again, helps make sure they do it. But another simple approach is to give them some readings or let them watch videos, and then just to do an online quiz outside of class. But you want to make sure that students are accountable for the basic learning of basic concepts outside of class, or it won't be the class time won't be quite as productive. One way of dealing with is using polling much more extensively with more elaborate problems and higher level problems. Having students work in groups, and this has been something used really extensively in STEM disciplines, where you give them problem sets, problem-based learning techniques, where you give them problems where they discover some of the basic applications or concepts through experimentation or working through problems. Again, with you providing feedback along the way, where the groups will report back out or they'll share their work, and you can provide feedback on them to help correct them. And also you typically would wander around the classroom and help them while they're struggling with some of the more difficult materials. Many active learning techniques involves, I'm going through this really quickly so we can get to some of the resources. If anyone has any questions or wants to suggest something, though, please just do at any point. Large component of active learning and practice involves some form of peer instruction and cooperative learning, where basically students are learning from each other. There is that social aspect of learning where we do learn more effectively when we're working with others. Some students will come into class understanding certain concepts, but not others. Others will come in understanding some of the other ones, but not the ones that other students might grasp. And by having students work together, as long as you can form somewhat balanced groups, the students who understand things better can deepen and reinforce their learning by having to explain it to students who don't quite understand it. And the students, and I've said this at several workshops recently, so I apologize for repeating it, but students who don't understand it as well generally benefit from hearing it from their peers, from someone who has just recently learned it, because they're often able to express it in terms that are easier for students to understand than when they hear it from an expert, by their instructors or graduate TAs if you have them, or undergraduate TAs. So again, pre-class quizzes are useful. Oh, you know what? I messed up there. I put this here and then didn't add anything to it. I duplicate, no, that's my fault. But a few other things you can do with this are group work on problem sets, role-playing activities. Let me go back one by one. Role-playing activities. Role-playing activities might be something where you have students do debates where they take on the roles either individually or in groups, where they take on the roles of people who support or oppose to certain propositions that relate to your discipline. One really popular form of this, which can be very short or very long activities, would be the reacting to the past series of scenarios that exist in a wide variety of disciplines, where basically you take some historical dispute within your discipline, you give students different roles associated with the people who were involved in that, and you have them come to some consensus after they argue and debated amongst themselves. So, you know, there are many historical scenarios where you have a group forming a US Constitution, for example, or in astronomy, you have a debate, for example, over whether Pluto should be a planet or whether it should be classified as a planet or not. And you can, the group that does the reacting to the past scenarios have put together at Barnard College, I believe, have hundreds of different scenarios that can apply in many different disciplines. Some of them would take place over maybe a half class period or whole class period. Others could go on for a week or more. And they have some really nice structured resources and documents that you can use for that. Debates I did mention. Games, there's growing, gamification has been of some interest for a while because students will sit for hours, sometimes for weeks at a time, mastering the different levels within an interactive game. And if we can gamify our classes so that students can see their progress, they can see that they're achieving certain learning objectives and so forth. And if we build some of the elements that are successful in game design into our classes, it might increase student motivation. You know, that with pretty much all well-designed games, they're designed at a level works with many people of different levels of expertise, so that you can learn some things really quickly and master certain skills, but then you have to work harder to get to higher levels. And the games, though, are always designed to provide ways in which students can learn or master those skills. And if we could do something similar to make it, we need to find ways in which students are challenged, but they're not so challenged that they give up, or the challenge level is not set so low that students are bored, that you need to find what's been called the zone of proximal development, or by, what's his name? I can't think of it. It was a Russian philosopher of education. can't think of it right now, but also Vygotsky. Right, thank you. And the same sort of concept is beyond Bjork and Bjork's desirable difficulties, that you want things to be challenging because that's where students most actively engage with it, but it should be at a level where all students can be successful. And what that means basically is you have to do it so that within the class's resources, there are resources available to help them learn or master those skills. So we have to provide some ways of bringing those students who have not yet acquired those skills, giving them the resources needed to allow them to be successful. And that can be challenging because what it will mean is that those students with less background in the subject generally need to do more work to attain the same level of mastery. But if in a well-designed game, students are willing to do this for stakes that may be a lot less important than their overall knowledge and so forth. Now, this is something which may not seem to be as much of a peer instruction or cooperative learning, but one technique that I've used in the past, I haven't used it recently, but I'm probably going to go back to it next year. I stopped it during COVID with so many students being out of class with COVID and various other illnesses. But a two-stage exam is when you give students an exam that they complete themselves, but then they work together in groups of typically 4 or 5 students to retake the exam as a group. And what happens basically is they get to explain it to each other. And it doesn't take as long when they're doing it, especially if you use either a subset or even all the original questions, because they've already answered them. So what will happen is they'll sit there and one of them will say, well, this is how I did it. And the others say, well, but you didn't consider this, and so forth. And what will happen basically is as a group, when they're sitting there, they'll explain things to each other and they'll all end up with a deeper understanding, and grades generally go up quite a bit on the second stage. And the way these are typically graded is that it's a weighted average of their original score and then the group grade basically. So, it encourages students to do their best on the first stage, but they can improve their score if they improve their understanding by working with a group. And I was surprised at just how engaging that activity was for students, because in the past where I had exams in, say, my econometrics class, I give them back and I go over them with the class and I ask them to explain things and so on for many of the questions. But what would happen basically is the students who did well would just sit there kind of happy and be pleased that they did well. And the students who did poorly on the exam were just kind of discouraged and gave up. And there wasn't a lot of focus on improving learning. But in the second stage, because there were some stakes associated with it, it's typically a quarter to a third of the grade is on the second stage. So there's some weight placed on that second attempt that can raise the overall score. Students have an incentive to engage with it. And one of the things that impressed me as I was wandering around the class was students saying, well, I don't remember us doing this. And then another student would say, well, remember that problem that we worked on for this homework assignment, or we worked on in class where we had a similar situation. And then the other students would say, oh yeah, now I see it. Rather than being resentful that they thought that this was something that they shouldn't have known how to do, they now are reminded by their peers that this was something that we did in fact do, and it's very equivalent to that. And when they hear it gently from their peers, it tends to be really positive. So they're laughing about it and they're joking about it, and they're generally really engaged in that discussion. I was really amazed by how well that worked when I last used that in Actually, I did use it in the spring of 2020, and I did try doing it in a Zoom environment, but that didn't work so well, partly because about a third of my students turned to Chegg for the first stage and just submitted their questions there and got their answers back. So in any case, collaborative projects are projects that are often longer term projects. Project-based learning is when students are engaged in a project that generally is a fairly large project. They could be community-based projects, and I know we've had lots of classes do that, where students developing websites have worked with local businesses, where community-based projects might involve working on improving something in the community. There are cases where students will address social issues or problems within the community, working with community members. And certainly that tends to provide a lot more intrinsic motivation for students. Open pedagogy is another form of active learning, where students are not just consuming knowledge, but they're actively engaged in producing educational content. That could be in the form of videos, it could be text. In my capstone course for a few years now, I had students for I think 4 or 5 years create books where they did it as a whole group. They broke up into groups of 2 or 3 and they wrote individual chapters, sometimes 3 or 4 when the class was larger. And throughout the whole semester, a substantial portion of what they were doing was to develop a book on a topic that they chose. And that worked really well. This past semester, they developed podcasts instead, because that's something they chose to do. So they could be audio files as well. And in this case, I had students work with other students in the class, generally 1 or 2 other students, to create a couple of podcasts on topics that were related to some of the issues that we were discussing in class, or something else that was related to the general theme of the capstone course. Student presentation certainly is a nice form of active learning. A really good way of doing it, though, is, or one way to consider doing it, is instead of having students get up and present their slides one at a time or one group at a time, where the students who aren't yet presenting are sitting there anxious if they have to present in the future, or perhaps a little bored if they've already presented, while the people presenting are kind of nervous. A really popular technique of doing this is setting up a poster session, which could be during class time, where perhaps depending on the class size, either you do it in some time separate from the class, and that works for all your students, and then you invite colleagues to come in and view the posters that students have created. Or what I've been doing in my econometrics class is having students create posters and display them, depending on class size, on either 2 or 3 different days, so that the students who were not presenting could go around and see the work that their fellow students had done and have them explain to it. So instead of having a 5 to 7 minute or 5 to 10 minute slideshow presentation, students are spending most of the class session just explaining their research projects to their fellow students. And I've generally invited my colleagues from the economics department to come down and talk with students about, about their work. And they really appreciate it when, when they have other faculty come down and work with that. Laura mentioned that Rebecca Peters does something in her anthropology 112 class, and that Laura was one of the raters for them for a few semesters. So students really like that, and it's much more fun to do that. Now, if you want to have them do really fancy posters, it's kind of expensive. So I just had students print things up and then tape them to a poster board. I've given them poster boards, so there's no cost to them, or they'll just do their own artwork on it with markers and so on. It's not as fancy as a formal poster, but I also don't want to have them pay $30 or $40 or $50 to create a poster using on-campus resources. Okay, so that's a really nice technique. And here's a set of resources. Let me go back there. Sorry. Here's some resources, and I'm going to, if you want to hold your camera up to that, you can get it from there, or I can grab this and put it in chat. Let me copy the link, and I'll drop it in chat, and we'll take a look at some of those resources. And I hope to put some more in there once I get more time. That may not happen this week, but it's at least it's a starting point. And Lisa was also one of the raters on that project. So if you go to here, there's a lot of this is just some basic meta-analyses. And if you don't do a lot of work with statistics, you might still have, you know, seen reference or read some meta-analyses. And these are basically studies of studies. So instead of doing a study with 30 or 40 or 50 or even 300 or 400 students, there are studies that look at all the studies that they can find related to a specific topic. So it might, for example, analyze 1,000 or 2,000 studies, each of which may have 30 or 40 students in it. So you end up with the ultimate. These meta-analyses are based on studies involving tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students in different types of experiments, where essentially it looks at the overall pattern of what variables are statistically significant and the magnitude of these effects across all these studies. So it gives you a distribution of the effect sizes of various types of learning approaches on, or various educational interventions on student learning. And there's a lot of them here, mostly in the last decade or so. Some of them date back a little bit longer. But what they all find is that active learning techniques result in substantially more learning than lecture. And you know, you could look at pretty much any of those studies and find it. I think all except one of them is available online. So I've linked to them. Many of them were funded by public funds. One that's not, unfortunately, is this one. But the others are all out there. The National Academy of Sciences is one of the bigger ones. And it does show, again, is one of many studies that find that active learning narrows those equity or achievement gaps for underrepresented students primarily in the STEM fields, but in other areas as well. In general, active learning often has some of the best effects in the STEM disciplines, in part because the equity gaps tend to be larger in the STEM disciplines than in many others. So those are, you know, you may want to look at some of those studies if you're not convinced about the benefits of active learning. And there's many more. These were just some of the most commonly cited ones. Then I put a link here to a variety of places where you can find some good examples of techniques. And I meant to put, I'll add some more to this. There's also some good ones from Vanderbilt that I forgot to put in. But there's some really good ones. Quinnell has a good list here. The Kate Patricia Cross Academy is one that I'm going to see if I can open this in a new tab, is a really good one. I'm not sure what it's, I'll turn it on. I don't even know what I'm turning on there, but that's okay. It's on this computer. I don't use it very much. So the Kate Patricia Cross Academy was developed by Clara Major and Elizabeth Barkley, who've both written several books and done a lot of research themselves on teaching and learning. And what's really nice about it is they have many teaching techniques here where they provide you with all the resources you need to implement it. So for example, if you want to do a digital story, you can click on view the technique, and you can go through and download an instructor's guide to it and watch a video describing how it's used and you know what strategies make it effective. And so, you know, here's the teaching techniques of it. And for each one of those, they have also, for each of them now, this is something that they've upgraded in the last 2 years, they've added an online version of it just so that you can use these either face-to-face or online. So they've effectively doubled the number of active learning activities they've had. And in here, there's also a discussion of you can search for things by the activity type. Where here, for example, it's active/engaged learning, learning assessment, presentation, project-based learning, reflecting the teaching problems that it solves in terms of here, low motivation or engagement, and also what types of knowledge that this, you know, in terms of what types of skills does this develop in terms of the, in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. And if you want, you could just search for all of these. Well, you can search their site by any of those to look for it. And it's a really, really nice resource. And the videos are very well done. And both Claire Major and Elizabeth Barkley are really good at explaining this, and they created the site and they do all the videos. They also have a book out called Engaged Teaching, a handbook for college faculty, but that one you actually have to buy. But it's a great resource, and it's one of many really good resources out there. And I've only put a few in here. This is a technique which many people have been using recently, the 3-2-1 approach, which is basically you can use it as an end of class activity, as a 1-minute paper type thing or something similar, where students write about 3 things they learned, 2 things they found interesting, and 1 question they still have about the content if you're doing a lecture. It's a nice simple way of adding an interactive component when you do have lectures in your class. You could have students create a contemporary issues journal and so forth. And there's many, many more here, as you can see. So this is one of the places I recommend most in using this, because again, they'll not only describe the technique and how to do it and best practices, they'll also provide you with rubrics typically and other resources that you can use to get started with this. So and it's a really good resource, as I've said too many times already. But cross currents library, I'm trying to remember what that is. Okay, so that offers articles on various things. So here's some other materials that they keep adding more resources to it. These weren't here the last time I looked, I don't think. So this is other guidance about teaching and learning and effective class design. But the techniques videos library is what most people tend to use the most with this. But knowing the people who created it, I suspect those other resources are extremely valuable too. Okay, so in any case, that's one place that I would recommend really highly, because the combination of the descriptions and the video resources make it really useful. And another book, which is an older book, it's not very expensive. I think it's like $17, $18, Dynamic Lecturing. If you want to start building some new materials, some interactive component to lectures, this is a good book to do it. Kevin Kelly and Todd Kryzik has another book on advancing online teaching, which focuses on equity-based activities, which again is primarily consists of active learning. There's another great book here, Teaching for Learning, 101 intentionally designed educational activities to put students on the path to success. And it's mislabeled because they actually now have about 200 resources there, because again, as in Claire Major, one of the developers of the Kate Patricia Cross Academy, contributes many of the same techniques to here in a book form, and I forgot who, Mark Harris, I think it is, and Todd Zakryzek have all done a lot of work on encouraging active learning techniques and so forth. And together they have, again, I think it's 200 and maybe 202 separate techniques, where for each of the, originally it was written for face-to-face instruction, but again, they added the online component. And I think that was one of the things that inspired Claire to go back and add more online activities to the Kate Patricia Cross Academy. And that academy, by the way, was created as an homage to Kate Patricia Cross, who was a mentor to both Claire Major and Elizabeth Barkley, and she just passed away actually a few months ago. But that's a really good book for, it's probably the most active learning techniques I've seen anywhere, and described really well. Another really nice collection of active learning techniques is at Purdue. This is a link to the Reacting to the Past website that I mentioned, where you can find those interactive role-playing type activities, and a really good detailed book that focuses primarily on active learning, but it's it's probably the best documented it's the best documented resource guide, which describes all the resources, all the research and the findings on the techniques that have been that are being discussed in there. It's a superb book. It's the 5th edition of it. It was originally done by Linda Nielsen. She was approached about doing a 5th edition, and her response was, no, not unless someone can help. So she brought in Todd Zakryzak, and it's a really, really good book. With more explanation of why the techniques are helpful and more hints on how to use things effectively. I threw in some podcasts from our podcast. 2 really interesting ones are by Doug McKee, who talked about the active learning initiative at Cornell and some of their findings from it. And basically, as in all the other studies that I mentioned, they found that introducing active learning benefits all students in terms of their GPAs, in terms of the amount that they recall, in terms of student retention, and in reducing those equity gaps. And it's a really interesting story that Cornell invested a tremendous amount of money in engaging in the active learning initiative over several years. And basically the way they did it was they had graduate students who were trained in active learning techniques work with the faculty and departments to help redesign their courses to build active learning components into it to help overcome some of the faculty resistance to it. And one study that there are many of these, but this is probably the most cited study addressing student resistance, was a study done at Harvard where students where some classes were assessed as being active learning, where active learning was being extensively used, and students in those classes were polled on how effective they found active learning to be. Well, some classes were entirely lecture, some were active learning. And what happened is that students in active learning classes felt that they learned less than they did when they were in a lecture class. And on the other side, the actual learning gains were measured in those classes, and they found that the active learning classes resulted in much more student learning and higher assessments of student learning at the end when the course was controlled. When the only thing that differed was passive lecture versus passive instruction versus active learning. Students preferred the passive lecture, and they believed they learned more when they were lectured at, despite the fact that they actually learned significantly more when they engaged in active learning activities. They didn't feel it was as productive. So one thing I do want to mention is that if you're using active learning and you're the only person in your department that is, it would be really helpful if you can explain to students why you're doing that, because student resistance can be non-trivial, where students will say, he or she is making us learn this material ourselves. I don't know why this instructor is being paid to do this, because we have to do all of our own learning. And you have to build a case explaining to them why you're doing that and demonstrating to them, if possible, how this has improved their learning, because students they're not used to it. And in general, students prefer the things that they're used to, and also that make them feel better about learning. And the things that make students feel better about learning are reading something over repeatedly until they can recognize the words on the page, but they don't enjoy as much having questions that they have to address, where they have to apply things where it's not as easy to do. So things that seem to be easier are generally preferred to students. Similarly, sitting in a lecture and listening might seem easier than actively trying to apply some concepts or to write something up or to do something where you have to do a bit more critical analysis and so forth. That's a bit harder, but it also results in more learning. So there is that trade-off, and the more we can help students understand that active learning is beneficial for them, the less resistance they'll have. And the more of us who do that, the less resistance we'll all face. So, it's a worthy cause because it will help students learn more efficiently. And if they learn more efficiently, they can be more successful without needing to spend as much time on the material as they do now for results that may not be as good as we'd like to see. And that's pretty much all that I've got. So I did say I wanted to keep this interactive or to have more discussion, but let me stop the share. Are there any techniques that you've used that you found really helpful or ways of addressing student resistance?
I mean, I think I kind of should do a middle ground. Like, I'll do a lecture, but I build in lots of questions and things through it so that, you know, they still can have like notes in their notebook sort of thing, you know? But yeah, I know they're not, it's funny because I just read my evals from last semester. And one of the comments you said was very close to a comment I got. Like, I don't know why, like, we end up having to teach ourselves or like, so.
We're supposed to do the learning for them, but I'll normally cite one of those things at the beginning of class explaining what I'm doing and say, some of you are going to feel that, you know, I'm not helping you learn, or I'm not doing that learning and making you do it yourself. But ultimately, I can't make you learn. That I can create an environment and give you resources that will encourage your learning. But ultimately, the learning has to take place in your own brain. And I can't get in there, but I can give you tools that will help you learn this material. But it's going to require work on your part, and all learning requires some work on your part. And they don't all buy that because, again, it's not something they've generally been exposed to, especially for freshmen.
Yeah, I would say the only other thing that I don't think I saw on your list was doing like a 1-minute paper at the beginning and
Yeah.
end of class. That especially when we're doing like I'm trying to think of an example of like you know, a concept or something that they really like, they might think they know a lot about, but they don't really know a lot about it. And so I'll have them do like a 1-minute paper at the beginning and then like do the, you know, we'll do the lesson and then have them like, okay, what would you go back and adjust? Like, has your position changed on what you thought you know about this?
I didn't talk about that, but I was thinking that in larger classes, at least, that could be done with polling, with the free response
Oh,
questions.
yeah.
So that's a very good use of it, letting students say their initial views of something initially, and then you do a class discussion on it or do a presentation, and then asking them how their views have changed is a really good polling technique. It's a good use of that, which it's pretty, because it all comes up in a spreadsheet. It's pretty, if you do want to grade it or even just do a completion type thing, it's really easy to skim through and assign grades on if you want to do that.
Yeah.
We can give them all credit as long as they submitted some response. Or it could be anonymous, in which case you wouldn't be assigning grades on it, but you know, but that's easier than having them all turn in papers if you have a large class.
Yeah, I mean, this was a smaller class, but I actually, it's actually what I've been using the blue books for. So like, I will make up a blue book for each of them, and then I just like will keep giving it out and collecting it from them so that they have the same blue book over the course of the, you know, so they'll have like, I don't do it every class, but, and then I can like, if I want to check and see if they're doing it, it's mostly just points for doing it.
And doing that as like a log type thing, or a blog, well, as a reflective log is a really useful technique. Having them reflect on what they've learned in class could also be done with those blue books. Or a journal would be another way,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
Any other, yeah, I mean, there's so many active learning techniques there. I just put a few down, but I was thinking of polling for that, and I should have mentioned that. So thank you. Any other active learning techniques that you've used that I found to be particularly effective?
One that I know that I've used and some of my colleagues in the library have used is the, what is it called? It's on that, providing sort of the outline for notes with like the key points, or the
Skeletal
key
outline.
areas. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's helped us, I think.
sharing a skeletal outline of notes is a really effective strategy. Gallery walks can be really useful. There's so many techniques. Jigsaws.
I like to incorporate ways to kind of get them up and moving, or also outside of the classroom sometimes. So I do certain like activities like through the lens assignment where they have to kind of go off on campus and kind of do something more active engagement, like photo voice projects or something like that, to kind of get them collaborating with their groups or things like that. Sometimes I just like to get them up and moving and out of the classroom with a little bit more engagement outside, on campus too, which I find kind of motivates them and gets them a little bit more engaged. Sometimes a change of pace, if they're going from class to class to class all day, can kind of help them or rejuvenate them in a sense sometimes, and kind of get them, excited again for the learning process.
Susan Rock has a whole book on that, Minding Bodies, that talks about the benefits of movement and, examining things outside of the classroom or even moving within the classroom. Any other thoughts? I mean, basically, active learning is good, and there's hundreds of ways of doing it. And here are some resources, and see if any of them works for you, that appeals to how you like to teach and what feels comfortable. Because if you don't feel comfortable doing it, it's probably not going to work very well. At least not until you acquire comfort with it. But there's lots of ways of doing it. It could be in small doses, or you could completely redo your course. We've had some courses here, not recently, but we've had some courses that were entirely based on a semester long reacting to the past scenario. Okay, well, we'll stop recording. And thank you for joining us, and have a good